Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for another Zeteo breaking news town hall. As the U.S. war on Iran opens up even further, today Iran carried out limited strikes targeting U.S. bases in Qatar and reportedly Iraq. Several nations have closed down their airspace in anticipation of and since, and havoc abounds. And as a reminder, we are trying our best to stay as abreast and on top of the breaking news as we can be, and that is best done with your support and your subscription. So please be sure to keep subscribing to Zeteo.com so we can continue to report our breaking news as it develops. And just as well, this is as well a live Q&A session, so please be sure to offer your comments and thoughts in the comments section, the Q&A section, and we will do our best to field as many as we possibly can. Without further ado, joining me now to discuss it all is Matt Duss, Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy and a former foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. He is also the former president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Thank you, Matt, for joining us on such short notice.
Yeah, thanks, Prem. Glad to be here.
So, start off the bat, what exactly happened today and why?
So today, Iran responded to Saturday night's attacks by the United States on nuclear facilities by launching an attack at or near a U.S. military base in Qatar called Al Udeid, which is the U.S.'s biggest military installation in the Middle East. It houses about 10,000 troops. Also houses a number of Qatari troops and a few from other countries as well. So an enormous symbol, obviously, of kind of U.S. empire or global hegemony or just military power. Apparently also firing at a facility in Iraq. I think I've seen less news about that thus far. I'm sure that will come in. But I think the symbolism of Al Udeid is important, but it's also important because it's a base in Qatar, which is a government that Iran actually has pretty decent relations with. So perhaps a little surprising on that end. But it does seem like this was not as violent and large an attack as one could imagine. It does seem pretty clear that there are no casualties as of right now. That, of course, could change, reported. But it seems that Iran needed to make kind of a symbolic response to the unprecedented invasion of its sovereign airspace by U.S. bombers. And that's what they did. Now, if in the past, Iran has signaled that we need to respond and we would like to de-escalate afterward, I think those are the kinds of messages that are going between the U.S. and Iran by intermediaries and others right now. But it seems like as reports come in of the amount of damage or the relative lack of damage and the relative lack of casualties, the ball will be in Donald Trump's court to decide where to go. Does he take the off-ramp, or does he continue to engage in this war alongside Israel?
Thank you. And we have a commenter from YouTube, Muhammad Ali, who asks something that I was just about to ask as well. So great timing, Muhammad. You kind of get at this a little bit about the calculus. Do you think, essentially, Muhammad asks more straightforwardly, was this response just a show of theatrics, similar to their response to Israel almost a year ago?
I think that's a good comparison. I mean, we saw, in response to several attacks, the attack on the Iranian diplomatic facility in Damascus, and then, of course, the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. Both of those generated Iranian responses, which were drone and missile rocket attacks from Iran into Israel that were not small, but they were certainly not as large as as many experts believe Iran is capable of. So I think that's a decent comparison, is to say, well, listen, we obviously cannot not respond, but we are choosing to respond in a way that is, relatively symbolic, but then, keeps open an option for de-escalating instead of making this worse.
So as you observe this, because of course, many people rightfully are just so concerned about the idea of even further escalation, even further than we've already gone. Do you see this as an escalation at all, or is it more, as they seem to be deeming, a proportional response geared towards an off-ramp? Like, how do you sort of observe it?
Well, I would say it's relatively equal. I mean, I don't know that there are any human casualties from the strikes that took place on Saturday, the U.S. strikes. Now, obviously, the Israeli strikes have killed hundreds of people. But if the U.S. strikes on nuclear facilities did not result in any casualties, I think for Iran to respond in this way, in a way that also does not create any casualties, I think that could be seen as like, okay, we've done this response, now let's dial it down.
Yeah. Shabazz Syed, also from YouTube, asks about, after this attack, do you think there are risks of this conflict spilling over into, and this kind of sounds silly in hindsight given how far we've come, but into a wider regional war? What do you know about the level of risk towards other nations of the region? Yeah. Are countries in the Middle East surrounding likely to get involved in any more material manner?
Yeah. Let's just say, war is always unpredictable. This kind of violence is always unpredictable. This is why it's a good idea to avoid it as much as possible. Just because, Iranians could be thinking that they are signaling one thing, but you cannot make sure that others are receiving the signals you intend to send, and that goes both ways and always. But as for this signal spilling out into a wider war, let's understand where we were before October 7. This has already spilled out into a wider war, and unfortunately, it has been driven by the United States and Israel, or at least driven by Israel and enabled by the United States, going back to the Biden administration, whose initial goal after October 7 was to keep Israel's war contained to Gaza. Now, I think that was a bad enough goal in itself. Their main red line, despite Biden talking about red lines here and there, red line in Rafah, his main red line was always making sure that the war did not expand beyond just Gaza. He basically gave Israel, essentially carte blanche to turn Gaza into a killing field, but he wanted to make sure that, it didn't spill over into Egypt or in Jordan or in other countries. But Israel, kind of made that decision for him by, bringing the war to Lebanon in response to Hezbollah rockets into the north of Israel. Into Israel, absolutely outrageous and condemnable. The amount of rockets that Hezbollah was firing were nowhere near what it's believed they could have fired if they had really wanted to come in support of Hamas, which they did not. And then it was, responding to Houthi rockets in Yemen, attacking Syria, essentially occupying parts of Syria now in the wake of the fall of Assad and the establishment of Syria's new government, and now expanding that war further into Iran. So I would say that war has already expanded. Now, to the question of what do regional governments do, clearly they don't want this war. They don't want it to expand any further. Interestingly, you've seen over the past few years a kind of détente between some of the Arab governments like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, and Iran, who had been, clearly at odds for a long time. You had, China being asked to broker this kind of warming of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran a few years ago. You even had Saudi Arabia and Qatar basically squashing the beef because they had been at real odds in their regional policies. And so I think there's a bit more concord between some of those governments. So I'm not going to say that these governments are necessarily unhappy about Iran's, potential nuclear capabilities being degraded. But I also think they are very conscious of the fact that this is the United States backing Israel in, obliterating another major Middle East capital. And they don't love that. And more importantly, they're aware that their publics don't love that. Their publics see these governments kind of standing aside ineffectively as Israel, with U.S. support, is attacking another major regional capital. And that's going to be a political problem for them.
It's interesting. You bring up this general idea that in some respects, entities like Iran, nations like Iran, entities like Hezbollah and so on, they have exercised this level of restraint, relatively speaking, compared to the absolute wreckage of international law that we're seeing from Israel and, of course, consequently the U.S. This, let alone norms, just this sense of any sort of satisfaction in terms of how things have gone over the past 20 months, let alone beyond that. So I wonder, so many people just question, to what end can this continue? To what end can Israel and therefore the U.S. continue on this just bloodthirsty path? How do you sort of navigate that question? Because of course we've asked that in the months after October 7th, 2023, a year after, approaching 2 years now, and of course seeing this violence spill out into Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and so forth, Syria. How do you sort of grapple with that question of just to what end, to what extent?
No, I think everything you said there, I mean, just the demolition of international law and norms regarding the protection of civilians that we've seen as a result, and we will continue to see as a result of Gaza is pretty staggering. Let's note here that Iran has been a violator of international law in various ways over many years, both internally and externally. But still, as you said, I mean, it's Israel and the United States, and especially coming just shortly after the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where the United States and its European allies, boldly proclaimed, these are international norms that we must protect, or else, the world will fall into chaos. And then to show, Gaza has shown that actually that doesn't really count for everyone. There are certain people who do not fall under that protection, which has done enormous damage to the entire concept. So yeah, I mean, I think we're in a situation right now where the U.S. and Israel are essentially creating a series of weak states that cannot challenge U.S. and Israeli power. And that will not change until it is met with some kind of counterforce. And, obviously there's no, country in the region that can meet either the U.S. or Israel on the conventional battlefield, which is why I'm really concerned that the pushback will come asymmetrically. It will come, as we've often seen, through terrorist violence, either in the region or perhaps outside the region, in the United States even. And I don't want to see that. No one wants to see that. But we have to acknowledge that resistance will come. If it doesn't come sooner, it will come later. And I'm thinking of, the famous, Jake Sullivan quote that was published, unluckily for Jake, in Foreign Affairs just days before October 7, which was that the Middle East is quieter than it has been in years. And that's true right until it's not, right? Because the idea that you can just kind of keep people repressed and in bondage, imprisoned, and face no repercussions, that's a fantasy. The question is when we are going to be taught once again that it's a fantasy. I want people to wake up before we have to deal with an event like that again. Yeah.
You bring up a former Biden official like Jake Sullivan and all that he and his colleagues represent. You think of the illusion of Trump as this dove, as this anti-war president that is all the more evident now, if not evident before. How do you think, Harley Johnson asked this from YouTube, how do you think Trump will retaliate? Will he retaliate and respond as he promised? Is that smoke and mirrors? Is he kind of just saying one thing, doing another? How do you sort of perceive what he might do next?
I mean, there's a few things. One is, what does he think makes Trump look good? I mean, if he is convinced that, okay, this was just a kind of symbolic retaliation, if he takes the Iranian messages for what I think they are, and he's willing to say, okay, I don't need to get any deeper into this. We saw this back in 2020 after he ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC commander, who was Iran's main regional strategist. Some people have called that response symbolic, but let's remember that was an hours-long missile attack on the Al-Assad base in Iraq. That's not what we've just seen here. I mean, that was a much more intense response that resulted in over 100 U.S. troops, being diagnosed with traumatic brain injury, like life-altering injuries. Thankfully, no one was killed, but those were very serious injuries. And still, at that point, even Trump decided, okay, I don't want to get deeper into this. I think he kind of went to the brink and decided, all right, I don't want to get any further into this. I'm hoping he makes that same choice here. I mean, but two factors are different. One is Iran is just considerably weaker now in the region than they were back in January 2020. Israel, even though I talked about what Israel's escalation, tactically, Israel has been pretty effective in weakening and degrading Iran's partner forces, Hamas, of course, but also Hezbollah, and the fall of the Assad regime has also, negated one of Iran's kind of main supply routes and its main ally in the region, which was the Syria's Assad regime. So Iran's much weaker, and you also have an active hot war being waged by Israel inside Iran, and Netanyahu is clearly desperate to get Donald Trump into this war in a sustained way, not just with one night of strikes, but a sustained way, because Netanyahu, having declared essentially the goal of regime change, has no exit strategy. He has no way out of this right now, that it doesn't look like clear failure. So he is desperate to keep Donald Trump by his side and engaged in this war. And so he's definitely pressing him on this.
That reminds me, too often throughout the past 20 months, we've kind of been sort of ping-ponging between the sense of on one hand, Israel and Netanyahu dragging the U.S. into actions that maybe it wouldn't have done otherwise, versus the other interpretation, which is that the U.S. is happily going along with whatever may be happening, that Israel's goals are not necessarily out of step with the U.S. In any sort of material sense. So how do you see this specifically playing out with regards to the question of regime change? I mean, we saw Donald Trump, for instance, truth socialing very flippantly about the same idea. Do you feel like Netanyahu is dragging the U.S. further into this war, or how do you view that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that the U.S. the U.S. is being manipulated into this by wily Netanyahu just kind of lets the U.S. off the hook. Yes, Netanyahu is a master manipulator. Yes, he is a liar. Yes, he's corrupt. Yes, he's all the things. But there's also a faction of foreign policy people in the United States, not just Republicans, they're Democrats as well. We saw this in the Biden administration, who their vision for the region is that Israel will act as the U.S.'s local sheriff in just stepping in and beating people up and keeping people down, and generally being the kind of the main force in the region. Obviously, the U.S. is the largest force, but is the person who can manage the day-to-day. But the ultimate vision here is of maintaining U.S. primacy, maintaining U.S. global military hegemony. So again, there is kind of a unity of effort between a faction of strategists in Israel and in the United States who very much agree on this. I don't think this is good for the United States or Israel. I think it's actually catastrophic for the peoples in both of our countries. Obviously, it's pretty catastrophic for the rest of the people in the region. But again, I mean, I think, yes, let's acknowledge that Netanyahu knows how to pull strings. He knows how to manipulate the U.S. bureaucracy, but we're not being tricked into anything here. I mean, this is a shared project by some pretty bad people there and here.
Yeah. Maureen from Substack asks, will Russia back Iran? I mean, we saw, of course, the suggestion that perhaps Russia or other nations might provide Iran with nuclear warheads. How do you sort of see Russia playing into this at all, or even other bigger nations?
Yeah, I think Russia right now, I mean, I don't think Russia, I mean, they have a relationship with Iran. Russia is obviously pretty busy in Ukraine. We saw that they weren't able to intervene in support of Assad in Syria, who was another major ally of theirs. But also, Russia is, Putin is watching the United States bleed resources and credibility in the region once again. And I don't think he's really displeased about that. In fact, he's, as I mentioned earlier about Ukraine, I mean, there were all these condemnations from US and European leaders against him for breaking all of these international laws and norms against invasion, about attacking civilians and knocking and blowing up apartment buildings. And then all these same leaders turned around and said nothing or outright supported when Israel did exactly the same thing in Gaza. So to the extent that international law, the credibility of even the idea of a rules-based order based on a shared set of values and principles is being degraded, as it certainly is, Putin likes that. Because a world in which might makes right is one that he is the one he would rather operate in.
Fawd Rafi from YouTube asks whether this attack might delay or terminate or hinge upon Iran's plan with regards to the Strait of Hormuz. What do you think about that?
I mean, that's a question a lot of people have. I mean, I tend to think that's something they will not do. I never want to say never, but that's something they're going to think really, really hard about. Not least because their main oil purchaser, China, gets, I believe, gets a significant amount of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, and if they were to shut that off, China would have something to say about it. And I think China is generally in the same position as Putin with regard to the war. They're watching the United States kind of, do the wrong thing yet again, and they're just going to sit back and let that happen. I mean, they understand that the global majority, which is countries that are not the United States and Western Europe, look at this and they're like, this again? I mean, these same people continue to write the rules for themselves and force everyone to live under it. So I think this war is another argument for China's soft power, and they're going to capitalize on that as they have in the past. But so again, that's why I think Iran threatening the Strait of Hormuz would be kind of a last move rather than a first one.
A lot of people bring up the counterfactual of if Joe Biden or Kamala Harris were in charge, how things would be right now. And of course, counterfactuals involve any array of if-thens that we can't, of course, project onto now.
Yeah.
But it strikes me that when people ask that, we neglect the simple fact that these people, as far as we know, are still alive and still have very large microphones and soapboxes. And it seems that they haven't necessarily disclosed how they would have responded in these situations if differently. So I wonder how you sort of respond to those ideas of if only Joe Biden or Kamala Harris were here, things would be different.
Yeah, I mean, one is with Biden. I think we know how he would have responded. He would have just continued to back Netanyahu doing what Netanyahu wanted. He would occasionally leak things to Barak Ravid about how he was very upset, and they had a very tough phone call. But would if anything, and I mean, that's all I'll say about that. But I would also say it's not just Biden; it's former Biden officials who are not saying very much, except for Brett McGurk, who now gets paid by CNN to go on and promote a war that his consulting firm is clearly looking to profit from. But with Harris, I mean, it's hard to say. She didn't talk about foreign policy that much. She certainly didn't. She made a mistake in my view in not distancing herself from Biden's policy. Her main foreign policy advisor, Phil Gordon, wrote what I think was a very good piece in the Financial Times a couple weeks ago, essentially praising Donald Trump for pursuing diplomacy with Iran, also saying that Donald Trump was taking some steps to kind of break from some old, outdated conventional wisdom. So I think there was definitely some creativity there. As for whether Kamala Harris as president would have taken some of these more creative, bold stances, I don't know. I tend to think people govern as they campaign. And the way she campaigned was very cautiously, afraid to show any daylight between herself and Biden. So listen, if you ask me what the difference would have been with a Harris administration, I think, first of all, we would not have gotten that January ceasefire, because the reason that Netanyahu agreed to that was basically to stay on the right side of Trump, and Trump sent Steve Witkoff to Israel to demand the ceasefire, which Netanyahu gave. I don't think he would have agreed to that with an incoming Harris administration, and I don't know that Harris would have, had what it takes to put the screws to Bibi, the way that Trump did. As for a war with Iran, I'm sure that that a Harris administration would not have kind of yellowish / green lit Israel's war, as it seems clear that Trump did. But also, I don't know that a Harris administration would have had the strength to oppose it once Netanyahu started it. So again, I think they definitely, a President Harris would have been much more cautious about an Iran war, and probably sent messages to Netanyahu not to do it. But if Netanyahu decided to, I've seen no evidence that Harris wouldn't do exactly what Biden did the whole time, was just back Netanyahu up.
And of course, what you lay out just perfectly underscores how poor of a choice so many people in this country, let alone the poor position we put people in Palestine and in the region, when we consider that Kamala Harris might not have had the screws to put it to Bibi Netanyahu, and then Donald Trump, who did it so momentarily and just for his own benefit. I mean, as we see now even just at the the supposed aid sites that the U.S. and Israel
Yeah.
are backing. It's just a slaughter every day. And so that just goes to show how limited people's choice are in this country for something that's truly anti-war. Karen Polly actually takes us from Substack. She takes us to Congress, where she asks not firstly whether Trump really does understand what he's doing, and moreover, whether Congress has the will and the guts to take back control over his decisions, to take these military actions. Of course, we're seeing now some level of an effort in Congress to seize some control through war powers resolutions. Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie leading an effort that has about 50-odd members supporting it. Tim Kaine in the Senate, Bernie Sanders as well. How do you sort of view Congress and their response to seizing some level of power back?
Right. Well, I mean, this has been an ongoing effort. I mean, I was part of this when I worked with Senator Sanders on the Yemen War Powers Resolution back in 2018 and 19. And that was one of the main goals of that whole effort. Well, first of all, was to stop U.S. support for a horrible war in Yemen. But second was to reassert Congress's constitutional authority over war, which as your viewers probably know, over many years, the president, the executive branch, has slowly taken more power to take unilateral action like the kind that we saw on Saturday night. And unfortunately, Congress has been okay with that, right? Because if you're going to tell members of Congress, you don't have to take these difficult votes, I'll just go ahead and do it, and then we can deal with it later. I mean, that's something that members of Congress find attractive when you tell them that they don't have to actually do a hard part of their job. I think they should do a hard part of their job. That's what we elected them for. And deciding when and where our country goes to war or not is among the most important and I think sacred duties that any member of Congress has. So it's not a job they should abdicate. As far as how this will go, yeah, I'm really glad to see these efforts by Senator Sanders, by Senator Kaine, by Congressman Massie and Khanna. It's going to be an uphill battle. I mean, we were able to pass the Yemen War Powers Resolution in 2019 and Senator Kaine's Iran War Powers Resolution in 2020 after the Soleimani assassination because we got 7 or 8 Republicans to vote with us in the Senate and a number of Republicans in the House as well. I don't know if it's going to look like that this time. I mean, Donald Trump has really established far firmer, much firmer control over the party than he had back then. But still, I think part of it, while we shouldn't get kind of trapped in process arguments, I mean, the goal here needs to be to stop this war. I do think that this process in the Senate and in the House, there is value in terms of prizing open a debate about what are we doing, like what are we achieving through this massive use of violence.
It's a very good point about the stakes itself versus getting lost into process. But I guess one aspect of this sort of mechanism of process is how low of a bar it seems, and yet how high it seems to be. I want to pose one other question related to this to you. For the fact that, we've spent the past year being brandished over the head with the idea that the Republicans were actually the anti-war party. Out of all 60-odd members of Congress who have supported some form of effort to put the brakes on this war, there's one Republican, Thomas Massie. Donald Trump is now pitching up super PACs to target and unseat him. On the other side of things, we have Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of the Democratic Party in the House, who just today, our friend Dave Weigel, reported just recently that he was asked if he supports Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie's War Powers Resolution. He says, quote, haven't taken a look at it. And so how do you sort of just react to this low bar of just the process question? You have on one hand, one Republican supporting this, and then Hakeem Jeffries, one of the faces of the Democratic Party, hasn't taken a look at perhaps one of the most pressing resolutions of this time, of his time as a leader.
I mean, let's understand, like Hakeem Jeffries knows what a war powers resolution is. So that was a bullshit answer. I mean, it's not a book about Iran. It's just, he knows exactly what a war powers resolution does because he's voted for 2 of them before. As for Trump and in the Republicans who aren't supporting this other than Massie, I mean, unfortunately, like we have kind of a cult here, right? And as Donald Trump said the other day, MAGA is what I decide it is. So he has now turned on a dime and, following the neocons into yet another regime change war, and he is now saying this is how we make America great, even though it contradicts everything he has said over the course of his past campaigns. And again, I don't think people should have any illusions. Donald Trump, he governed as a militarist president the first time. Okay. And so we should never take anything Donald Trump says at his word. I mean, this is a guy who lies all the time, but I do think the point I keep trying to make is like Donald Trump lied about being anti-war because he correctly understood that there is a anti-war voting constituency. There are voters who are tired of these wars. They don't want to see America making more war. They want America to make peace, and they want a president who speaks to that. And that is why we need Democratic leaders and a Democratic Party that can really move into this space. Not just because it's good policy, because it's good politics.
Madeline from Substack asks if there's any hope for national law to be reformed, strengthened, enforced with respect to the actions of Israel or the US right now. And she wonders what kind of possibilities there is perhaps for international coalitions which can stand for human rights and peace at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. We've seen, the so-called rules-based order really kind of corrode and start to collapse over these past decades. And I have to say, like, one of the kind of really the main things that did that was the U.S. invasion of Iraq. This was the world's superpower, the country that played the major role in establishing the post-war order and all of its rules and norms and conventions, kind of cast those to the wind when it deemed it necessary. There's blame to go around, but I really think it's hard to overstate the kind of negative impact that really had on the entire concept. I mean, I think the question, I don't have a great answer right now because we're in this moment of, an interregnum, as Gramsci referred to it, where the old order is dying and the new order is struggling to be born. What does that new order look like? How much of the old order is worth preserving or even able to be preserved? How much of the old international institutions like the UN, like the Human Rights Council, and these other, bodies that were created in the wake of World War II to make a more peaceful and humane world, how many of them are salvageable? What would that even look like? I don't know, but I think it is, it is one of the most urgent questions we have right now.
Well put. And one more question for you, Matt. As we have these discussions, I feel personally so often, we get bogged down in the war making and the strategy and the gameplay and gaming things out. And then, of course, the righteous fury at what we're witnessing. How do you, as someone who's an expert on this and a commentator on this and just, of course, care so deeply about this, center the real stakes here, which is the populace, the millions of people in Iran, and, of course, the surrounding area, Qatar, UAE, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Gaza, the West Bank. How do you personally center those stakes, the people that we've seen for not only the past year and a half, but years and years and years subject to this vicious cycle of US-backed violence, unconditional aid to Israel, and just this appetite for war rather than peace, for violence rather than taking care of people? How do you, as someone so involved in this, center that in your work?
Yeah, I mean, just as you said, to just understand both by trying to pay as much attention I can to voices from the region, traveling there whenever I get the opportunity to see and talk to people and just understand that, to understand, like, we talk about foreign policy here in Washington and we treat all of this as numbers on a spreadsheet. But we're talking about human lives. We're talking about families and communities. And I don't think it takes a lot to kind of, make the kind of emotional investment required to understand that. I mean, it's not calculus, man. But I'll also say this too, it's about people in that region and people around the world who have suffered at the pointy end of America's global hegemony, and some of whom who have benefited. I want to acknowledge that too. I don't want to paint a picture here of just kind of United States as this kind of global supervillain only. I'm also concerned for people here in the United States. Because we see how authoritarian leaders throughout history and now use these kinds of external attacks, launching wars abroad to increase repression at home. And this administration has clearly been laying the groundwork by attacking pro-Palestine protesters as material supporters of terror. We've seen people literally snatched up off the streets. Mahmoud Khalil is free now, thank goodness. I hope he will stay free. I'm glad he was released. There are others who are still in prison. But should there be some kind of attacks here or some kind of other crisis, this administration has shown that it has no compunction about snatching people up and imprisoning them for exercising their constitutional rights. So as much as I do, want to work and act in solidarity with my friends and colleagues, and also people who I have not even met in the Middle East and around the world, I do want to say, I'm also very conscious of the impact on communities here in our country, and if people can't don't have the kind of emotional maturity to care about people out there, at least care about people here.
Well put, well taken. Our friend Naomi Klein might just need to write a sequel to her shock doctrine at this point. But Matt, thank you so much for your time and your insight. Everyone watching and listening, thank you for tuning in and for sharing your questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of it. There's only so much time we have today. But thank you, Matt, seriously so much for sharing your time. And to everyone listening, not only thank you for tuning in, but thank you for your support for Zeteo and our work that we do. We have a small but mighty team, lean and mean. We're trying our best to hold the powerful accountable, to do the work, to give voice to the voiceless, to keep holding people's feet to the fire, to, if nothing else, do the work that you all very much deserve and are sorely missing from much of the rest of the media ecosystem. So please continue to support us, subscribe to us, tell your friends, family, those you agree with, those you don't agree with. We're trying to build a bigger, more people-serving media ecosystem here, and that starts with all of us here. So thank you so much. Thank you again, Matt. Everyone, please be safe, take care, and we hope to see more moves towards peace rather than war ahead. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Prem.